Talking Cougar football once again with Alex Brink. The Cougs coming off of a tough loss in the Apple Cup at home. Alex, this is a game that if you just look at the final score, you didn't watch the game, you're going to think the Huskies won this going away from start to finish. But this was a very close game through most of the game. The Cougars played very well with the Huskies, multiple times bringing it back into a one-score game. Obviously, at the end, it gets out of hand. But what did you see from the Cougars really throughout the game that gave you maybe some optimism of how they can play with a team with a roster like UW's?
Sure. I mean, it was probably the best offensive performance we saw through three quarters. A lot of that has to do with Zevi Eckhaus. I thought he played really well. In the end, the offense is playing from behind, really from the get-go, right? Pretty much down 14 points the whole game, kind of scrapping and clawing to get back. And it's a hard spot to be for an offense and a quarterback, right? With no running game, and you're trying to, eventually you're trying to just make a play, and he throws the pick six and it starts to get away from you. So, if the defense probably could have gotten a stop along the way, you can kind of second guess the onside kick decision after in the third quarter, but I think in the end, Washington State probably just had a little too much up against it and didn't play well enough overall to give themselves a chance in the end.
First, about the positives, the offense, you mentioned it. Zevi Eckhaus gets the start, and we really just see an offense that we hadn't seen really outside of the good points of the San Diego State game. What was it about? Was it just Zevi's presence? Was it different play calls? What did you see from up in the booth that led to the Cougars having so much more success moving the ball on offense?
I mean, Devy's a big part of it. He's a really good decision maker. He makes plays with his feet, both not just running the ball, but kind of getting out of the pocket, extending plays, which puts pressure on the defense to defend the whole field. The other thing I liked is that, I think offensive coordinator Danny Freund kind of got back to what we saw against San Diego State. And I think they were trying to do it against North Texas, but obviously had the turnovers, is spreading the field sideline to sideline, utilizing some of the team speed at the receiver position, right? Not being so committed to the run, still mixing it in. But I just think for this Washington State offense, they're at their best when they're throwing the football and they're letting those athletes go make plays, whether it's Devin Ellison, who we saw come out and finally get an opportunity. Josh Meredith was a big part of it. You still saw Tony Freeman in the mix, Trey Lechner. That group, that receiver tight end group is really talented. And when you have a guy like Zevi Eckhaus that can distribute, I think that's probably where you're playing your best ball.
Absolutely. Now, a bit of the negative was the defense. But it wasn't just that the Huskies were marching, 4 or 5 play drives and getting in the end zone. What was so puzzling was that the Cougars were getting the Huskies into second and longs, third and mediums, and just couldn't get off the field on third down. Was there anything that was a common thread of why they maybe couldn't get off the field on third down? I believe the Huskies only were 8 of 9, I believe, on third down in the game.
Yeah, from my standpoint, I thought it was kind of a mix of things. For one, I think in those second and third and long scenarios, the play calling was a little conservative. It was a lot of coverage, kind of rushing four, and which I get. You want to put guys in coverage. You hope you can contain Damon Williams, but in the end, you saw kind of your best plays against Williams were when you brought pressure because that confused him. You're able to get him to the ground. In the end, he's going to make a few plays with his legs because he's so gifted. I think at times on those long down situations, you maybe made it a little too easy for him. And then ultimately, it comes down to the players too, right? Like they had chances to get him to the ground, they had chances to make tackles, and they didn't do it. So I think it's kind of a mix of just poor execution and maybe a mix of being a little conservative on those long downs. In the end, this defense has to figure out kind of who they are, right? Both from a player and a coach standpoint. Are they going to be aggressive? Are they going to attack? They're going to kind of try and play it a little more safe and make teams earn it. Well, when you play against good offenses like, the Huskies, and particularly with elite quarterbacks like Damon Williams, it's hard to play like that.
Imagine though, getting the pressure, getting those opportunities and maybe just not capitalizing on those means you don't have to just throw out the entire defensive playbook because obviously the Cougars are having some success. It's just capitalizing on it, getting him to the ground on some of those times that he brought pressure. So defensive scheme wise, do you think the Cougars are in a good spot with their scheme in terms of what they're drawing up to try and stop these offenses?
I think in general they are. Actually, one thing I really like that I hadn't anticipated going into the season, I really like the Cougar pass rush. I mean, I think the defensive ends are doing a really nice job, whether it's Isaac Terrell, Ram Stevenson, we saw Buda Paletti get in the mix. I mean, I think those guys are doing a nice job. And then you add in some of the pressure packages. Parker McKenna got home on one. That piece to me is really good. Again, I think in coverage, you're just seeing at times it feels like there's again lack of execution. They're either misaligned or they're not kind of recognizing what receivers are coming into their zone. And that's where those big plays tend to happen. So I think scheme-wise, they're in the right spot. Again, some of the execution, you're going to need to see those guys continue to step up. I mean, it's a lot of veterans that are on that field that are probably making mistakes that the coaching staff would say they shouldn't be making. So again, through 2 weeks, right, Idaho and San Diego State, it was like, gosh, this defense is special. They're going to kind of carry the team. And then the last 2 weeks, although North Texas is probably not a fair characterization, but certainly this last week versus UW, you felt like they were the kind of the Achilles heel. This team in general for Washington State needs to figure out how to play complementary football. The defense has to play well when the offense is playing well. To this point, we haven't really had that.
And 4 games in, it kind of feels like this is kind of a make or break moment, a huge game this week before you head into the bye. Really feels like, I don't want to say it's a do or die moment, but if you want this season to have the trajectory that you want to have, it feels like getting this win on the road heading into the bye week would be huge. Playing complementary football, that's so huge. We'll talk about it from the offense. What did you see in the Apple Cup from the offense that you want to see continue, and maybe where's an area you still need to see them improve as the season goes on?
Yeah, one thing I really liked was kind of the commitment to taking some shots, right? You saw a couple instances of them going downfield, and whether it's Meredith or Ellison, there's guys on that roster that can make plays vertically. That gets in that, in the end, that really excites guys, right? Like people get excited about big plays, and you get chunk plays, and those explosives are hard on a defense. So continuing to build on kind of the explosive pass game, I think it's important. I think they had opportunities. You heard Jimmy Rogers in his presser on Monday say, man, the running game's close. Like we had opportunities. And I would agree with that. I think they were a step away or kind of a block downfield away from having a couple big ones. So continuing to build on that. And then the last piece was, how do you use Zevi Eckhaus with his mobility, whether it's him in the running game or just getting out on the perimeter, continuing to build on that side of it is going to create some challenges for defenses.
One more note on the offense, something that I just remembered that was brought up in the Monday press conference with Coach Rogers. It seems that, and Coach Rogers has mentioned Jackson is more of a stationary quarterback. That's why they tried to implement Julian Duggar at times. But it feels like with Zevi, they're more comfortable moving the pocket. Have you noticed that? Some of those design rollouts or even just plays where he can escape the pressure helps with some of those downfield throws and not just have to settle for the first read, a quick 5-step hitch, things like that.
I think, where Zevi is different is just his creativity kind of in the pocket and off schedule. I mean, the offense, even under Jackson, you saw some nakeds, you saw some boots, you saw things where he was getting out of the pocket and he can throw on the run. Jackson, that is, really well. And Zevi's similar. Again, the difference is, that Zevi, when he gets pressure, he's going to climb in the pocket. He's going to get outside. The first big throw to Devin Ellison was off schedule, and it happened because Zevi broke the pocket. The defense reacted to him, and then Ellison's wide open behind. So, I think that's where the difference is, and that puts the pressure, really on the defense.
This one for you, as the Cougars get ready to go take on the Rams. This is a future Pac-12 game, and we've already seen one of those this year with San Diego State. How big are these games? Typically in another year, you would think, kind of interesting playing a team you've never played before, but now this is going to be a conference opponent. How important is it not only to go get a win? Obviously, you always want to get a win, but kind of get some familiarity with a program that you're going to be scouting down the road for who knows how long?
I think in general, you mentioned before kind of the crossroads this team is probably at in their season. Going into the year, the talk was really how do you get to a bowl game, and you knew the Apple Cup was going to be a tough game no matter what. North Texas to me was kind of a toss up to begin with. You get your first two against Idaho and San Diego State, and San Diego State just beat Cal by like 35 points. They shut them out. So, that looks like a really good win against, like you said, a future conference opponent. So if you go on the road to Colorado State, that future conference opponent, and you're able to get a win, I think it goes a long way in just in general, really feeling good about kind of where you're at, because you can explain away the 2 losses at that point pretty easily, But if you can go in and beat the Rams, I think you get a lot of momentum, 1, in the season, but like you said, 2, just looking forward, because in the end for Washington State, really big picture, right? If they want to compete if they want to compete at a national level and be a part of the conversation, they have to be what Boise State was in the Mountain West, right? Which was dominant year in and year out. And Washington State and Oregon State and probably Boise to some degree are trying to figure out if they can be that in the new Pac-12. And I think starting that foundation now is important.
All right, still a lot to be had this season and still a lot to be heard from Alex Brink. You can catch him with Michael Bumpus on Talking Cougs on Root Sports. We'll have a link to their YouTube channel as well here in the description of this article. Cougs taking on Colorado State this Saturday. Our SWX sports team will be on the ground in Fort Collins, continuing to bring you all the coverage, and we'll continue to talk with Alex Brink throughout the season. Alex, thanks. Always good to talk to you, and we'll see you down in the home of the Rams.
You betcha. Thanks. Go Cougs.